Hello, everybody. Either good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night to wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining for this impact versus intent class today. Um, I am Sabine la Crespele. I originate from Artemisia. My pronouns are she, her. And mundanely, I am also a therapist out of Salt Lake City, Utah. And so I end up using this class and these concepts both within the SBA and also within my life. And so it's something I am pretty passionate about and really looking forward to entering into a discussion with everyone around this. I also appreciate some grace today as well. So yesterday I ended up moving. Not ended up, like it's been planned, but it's been a week of just like, this week has been nuts. So yeah, the background is incredibly blank at this moment because of that. So thank you for the grace in advance of understanding that current situation for me. So yeah, I think without further ado, let's get started. I think as a reminder, as Ashaksi said, if there are any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat. And also, throughout the class, we might have breaks to see if people are comfortable asking questions or making comments. But then they will also be part of the recording, just to that. So yeah. So let's talk about what the big deal is with intent versus impact, or impact versus intent. Is it the thought that counts, or does the outcome matter more? And so when we talk about understanding what these are, it's important to look at like what the definitions are, and really understanding what each thing is. And so intent is really the purpose or reason you are attempting to communicate a message. And it tends to infer the kind of person someone is based on what is inherently behind the message. And I think that can get really tricky when sometimes the impact is different than our intent. And that's where we can have a lot of friction. And then the impact is the result or the outcome of an action. And it can separate a person from their behavior and allows the impacted to be acknowledged as much as, if not more than, the speaker. And that's why it's important that I think we acknowledge both. And we'll talk about a little bit more why throughout this. Usually, the conversation of intent and impact occurs when a miscommunication or perceived harm has occurred. Usually, like when people are on the same page, there isn't really like, oh, we need to talk about the impact of that because we both understand the intention. It's usually when there's like a misalignment that it's like, wait, I didn't mean that. And that's where the perceived harm happens. And then we tend to agree that impact is equally important to intent until we learn that our intent had a hurtful impact. And then I think we get a little like, oh no, that's not the kind of person I am, right? And that's where we refer back to the intent because it infers the kind of person we are. So, there we go. So the current train of thought seems to be more focused on protecting the intent or the character of individuals rather than the impact experienced by the receiver. So I like this picture down at the bottom because it's actually something I have done. I have, as a teenager, unintentionally run over someone's foot before in a car, and it was one of those moments where felt incredibly bad, but it didn't really matter what my intent was because it was an accident. The impact was this person was seriously injured. And so I think that's something that even with, the littlest, and I put that in quotes, the littlest of slights, it's something we need to keep in mind that sometimes it doesn't matter what our intent is if our impact has some significant harm to it. And most of us don't really have malicious intentions. A lot of the time we say something that we don't realize could be hurtful, or we don't realize maybe has some baggage to it, or things like that. And it's uncomfortable to learn when we hurt someone. For those who may be aware of like the kind of the hero's journey, I think we all, we tend to be on our own sort of hero's journey, right? And we tend to believe that we are, the hero, and it's hard to hear that sometimes we can be the villain and or the victim in certain situations. And so understanding that, one, if we hurt someone, it doesn't necessarily mean we're no longer the hero in our own journey. It just means that, oh, we've messed up and we need to own accountability for that. And then we also need to acknowledge that we've all been victims as well of perceived slights or of actual slights, and recognizing how painful that is and having that empathy for people when we hurt them. And the problem with intent being more important than impact is that it creates kind of a victim blaming situation, in that, people saying, well, I didn't mean it that way, or you're being too sensitive. It reduces or dismisses accountability for the person who did the hurting. And so the whole point of this class is really looking at how important first acknowledging the impact is, and then we can look at intent. But I think what we tend to do is reverse that, and we look at the intent first rather than the impact, and it dismisses that. But both are equally important. I think it's just figuring out, when are they important, when are they appropriate. And so let's talk about kind of the pros and the cons of understanding the intent for people. And I do this a little bit backwards as well, because I know I just mentioned, like, we need to understand the impact first. But since we are looking at this as kind of the current train of thought, let's look at it like from this lens of, okay, this is where we're coming from. So in understanding intent, it allows for grace and benefit of the doubt. Of, if we understand that people didn't mean to hurt us, then it gives us a little bit more of that, oh, okay, we can give the benefit of the doubt, both to others and ourselves, of like, oh, okay, I didn't mean it that way. It doesn't necessarily mean that we get to dismiss it. It just means we get to have that grace and benefit of the doubt. It also demonstrates self-awareness of, where we were actually coming from, or where the other person was coming from. In a way as well, like psychologically, it provides self-protection when we are immediately going to that kind of defensive place of, oh, I hurt someone and I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way. That is a bit self-protective, because then we are protecting ourselves from feeling like the bad guy or the villain. And the intent, if we look at it, could be, used to connect and build relationships. And I think a lot of the time that is generally the intent for most people, is to try to connect and build relationships. It just goes poorly. It goes really poorly for one reason or another. And so when we look at, that fundamental aspect, that could also allow for benefit of the doubt. The psychological impact as well, when we know someone's intent wasn't malicious and wasn't meant to hurt us, is that it actually reduces the impact on us. And so, for example, a couple of months ago, my mom and I had kind of this like interesting interaction in this exchange, and I was feeling defensive and hurt, and I reached out to her wanting to check in, being like, hey, was this what you were meaning when you said this? And what was going on there? Because I wanted to see I kind of wanted to sort of put a nice litmus test on what is the impact actually, if that makes sense. And so knowing the intent from that exchange helped lessen the impact for me, because she didn't mean to hurt me, and she explained kind of where she was coming from. And for her, she was coming from kind of her own hurt. And so it allowed me to have better empathy in that way. And so understanding intent also really helps with better empathy as well. The cons is that when the conversation stops at intent, it demonstrates privilege. Like wherever you are, it demonstrates that you have more power in that dynamic, in that conversation. And the conversation really can't stop there if we want to understand both. But if we stop it, oh, well, they didn't mean it that way, then it just completely demonstrates privilege. It also deflects any criticism about oppressive language, which we'll get into in a little bit around like more of the specific examples. But when we are trying to dismantle oppression, and language is a big part of that, if we are deflecting of, oh, they're just being too sensitive, then we aren't able to dismantle oppression in the way that we need to. It implies, oh, no, I don't want that to make a change. There we go. Sorry if everybody saw that. That was a random weird thing on my computer. So it implies that the speaker's identity and message matters more than that of the impacted. And that's just not true. Like both are equally important and the impacted needs to be acknowledged. And conversely, intentional aggressions are linked with higher levels of suffering. You know, when we know that someone is actually trying to harm us, then the impact is that much greater, basically what I'm saying. And then understanding impact. When we understand the impact, the way it had on someone else, when we recognize the hurt, it validates and it creates healing. It increases our own self-awareness of like, oh, this is how this could impact someone. And when we understand the impact and truly understand the impact, not just kind of, you know, as a checklist, it can allow for repair in relationships. And I think we've all been there in those moments where there have been people who have hurt us and they sort of like mentally, maybe they get it, but emotionally they don't. And then we've been there with people who emotionally get it and understand the impact that they've had. And the feeling is really different. And if you reflect on that, like that the repair in each one of those kinds of dynamics can be really different. And so when we really truly understand the impact that we have on someone, that allows for that connection to grow, if that was the intent before, kind of signaling back to that last slide of if the intent was for connection and it was a missed mark, if we really understand the impact, it will have that connective piece and it will actually make the connection stronger. The research shows that the stronger the repair, actually the stronger the connection. Actually, the research shows, I recently heard that between mothers and children, or parents and children, really only 30% of like attunement or, you know, when people are really attuned to their kids happens 30% of the time. The rest of the time, 70% is in repair. And that's where a lot of the connection builds. And so that's why I'm kind of bringing this up a lot, is because that repair is going to be so important. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later as well, how to repair and kind of the best ways to repair. And then again, yeah, allows for correction and learning opportunities. I think most people want to grow and be better. And so understanding our impact allows for that. And then it demonstrates accountability, which is huge. I think it shows the kind of character that you are, even if like our intent didn't match our character, the accountability will also show our character. The cons is that typically when people are confronted with how they've maybe negatively impacted someone, it can trigger a defensive response in the speaker, in the person who made the harmful impact. And so we need to be aware of those defensive responses and what's coming up for us, because it's likely tapping into our own shame. And we might then project the wrongdoing onto the receiver of, well, you just took it the wrong way, right? Which may or may not be true. Something that I think is important for us to be aware of is just like kind of what I'm calling internal filters, which is just sort of like our history, right? And so if someone said, so like, for example, um, all throughout my life, I have a really strong aversion, and I'm going to use this word, but to demonstrate, I have a really strong aversion to the word crybaby, because it was something I was called a lot as a kid, and I was a very sensitive child. And so that word, if someone uses it, I have a really strong reaction to that. It actually has more of a intense impact than maybe on someone else. And so it's something for us to be aware of, is like, what is our history playing a role with here? And I think that can, be pervasive with a bunch of different things. But recognizing that someone else's history actually may create more impact than we are aware of. And not understanding that can be really, really detrimental to the repair process. And then, yeah, I think a lot of the time when our intent is misunderstood and it has like more of a negative impact, we feel misunderstood, we may feel stupid, we may have all of those sort of like self-judgments and shame. And so those are really, really difficult to sit with at times, when we are trying to understand the impact that we've had on people. So I'm going to stop here to see if there's any questions or comments or anything along those lines. And oh yeah.
There is one question in the chat.
Yeah.
It says a lot of this depends on someone wanting to, in fact, connect, but some people don't want that. They don't want to repair. They want to be right, whatever that means to them in whatever context. What happens then?
What happens when people just want to be right? That's a great question. So I think there's a couple of different ways we could go about it. One is, so I have a client that I work with who has this great example where she talks about, I need to learn not to try to go to Silversmith when I want bread. And so recognizing that if someone isn't willing to repair with you, if someone is only willing to be right, then you absolutely have every right to set those boundaries for yourself and not engage with that person. Because the understanding the impact is when we have done the wrong, right? And if they're not willing to understand the impact, I mean, that's their work that you don't have to do. You don't have to do their work for them. All the work you have to work on is healing and being able to move forward yourself. And unfortunately, if they're not willing to repair, if they're not willing to understand the impact they've had on you, if they just want to be right, you have every right to sort of say, okay, you know what, that's the end of this for me. Or, set boundaries in terms of like, I don't really want to engage with you in these conversations because it doesn't feel like a conversation. It just feels like you want to be right. And that's actually a conversation I get into a lot with my partner, because he tends to be that way at times, where he gets very focused on wanting to be right, and I tend to call it out and I say, I think right now you're just wanting to be right and you're not wanting to have a conversation, and so I'll come back to this when maybe you're in that space of wanting to actually have a conversation. So that's kind of how I handle it with people in my life where I can't cut off and don't want to cut off. But then there are people in our lives that maybe it's like, okay, we're going to have some distance from them now because they need to do their work, and that's not my responsibility. Does that help answer the question? Are there more thoughts around
that? There's another question.
Okay.
Will you be talking about strategies for having these hard conversations? I understand your intent was X, but the person you were talking to was impacted in a different way. I'm someone who has privilege and, oops, oh shoot. I am someone who has privilege, and I have people in various relationships with who I may sometimes need to have these kinds of conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to get to that. So yeah, thank you for the question.
And then the other one is, what's the best answer to someone? I have a few in my family who hears what you've been saying and is like, oh, so that means the victim is always right?
Hmm. Can you repeat that one?
What is the best answer to someone who hears what you have been saying and responds with, oh, so that means the victim's always right?
Oh, okay. Okay. I see. I see. I don't, I think that the question is it about being right? Or I go back to the Brene Brown quote of, do I want to get it right or be right? And so I think that would probably be how I would respond to it, is like, I don't know if necessarily the victim's always right. And at the same time, I would rather get it right and look at building a relationship and repairing if anything needs to happen, versus just trying to be right and getting in and further in that conflict. I think that's what I'm hearing in that is pretty black and white thinking of either you're right or you're wrong, or you're the victim or you're the hero. And I just think it's way more nuanced than that. And it's frustrating. It's really, really frustrating because, uh, you know, this, we can't do work for other people, if that makes sense. I hope that answered the question, but I guess that's just kind of what comes to mind with that quote of am I here to get it right or to be right?
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yeah, there's one more here. Sorry, I've got to kind of scroll to read it. Maybe I just make it bigger. Um, Across Facebook, I've seen multiple instances of the impacted saying, it's not my job to tell you what is right to say, when someone is trying to meet in the middle, repair what was perceived as a negative situation. How does this person who is trying to meet in the middle or understand the perspective proceed?
Hmm. I wish I had an example of that. Um, so just to make sure, Ashaksi, that I'm understanding the question, on Facebook, there are people who are trying to like kind of meet in the middle between understanding the impact and understanding the intent. Is that kind of how it reads?
Um, how does the person who is trying to meet in the middle understand the other perspective? Oh, okay. So what I think they're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is uh if somebody tells you it's not my job to educate you, how do you respond to that?
Oh, okay. So if you, okay. So if you are trying to understand and the other person is saying it's not my job to educate you or heal you, is that what the question is? Then how do you respond?
I think it is. That's my interpretation of it.
Okay. Um, if that's the case, then I think in some ways they are right in that, like, yes, we all need to be doing our own growth and healing, and that's not just on the victim to kind of be doing that work for us if we have done some harm. So I think it's one of those things where if we are struggling to really understand how we have harmed someone, then it kind of, what I'm seeing is it kind of goes both ways. Because on the one hand, if the person is genuinely trying to understand and saying, like, okay, help me understand why crybaby hurts you, right? Just going off of that example for me. And I would, and then I would say, well, I was called a lot that as a kid. If someone were to then continue to say, well, I still don't get why that hurts you, then at that point, it's kind of like, okay, well, I don't know how else better to explain it to you I was called a lot that as a kid. It's hurtful. And so I would rather not be called that. And if they continue to say that, then they are stuck kind of in their own, I think they're still stuck in wanting to understand their own intent and not really wanting to understand a hurtful impact. And I think at that point, that would then rest on them to do the work of understanding, hey, different words have different meanings for different people. But it is not my job at that point to provide that emotional labor to make them understand why it's so impactful for me, because I've already done that work, and then the rest of that's on them.
So do you think at that point, maybe they go to a third person to kind of get some perspective?
Yeah, third person or Google, or there's a lot of different avenues that they could go. Absolutely. Therapy, again, I'm a therapist, so I'll advocate for that, but trusted friend, that kind of thing.
Do you want more questions?
Let's see, let me check the time. Maybe let's move forward and then we can pause in a couple slides for more questions. How does that sound? Cool. All right. So let's talk about important considerations. So there we go. So the important considerations are, we are going to make mistakes. We are not perfect. We are all humans. We're all just humaning the best way we know how. And so recognizing, I think, that for ourselves, but then that for others as well, can be really, really helpful in this process. As well as separating someone's behavior from their personhood when we call into question their actions. I have a video in a couple of slides to really kind of nail home how we do this, and going back to the further the following question of how do we do this, is we call into question their actions. We really separate who they are as a person. Then that person can choose if that's the character they want to imbue. So I love this example during the Me Too movement. I believe it was either the producer or the director of Community, that TV show Community, was harassing one of the female actresses or actors on the show. And when that was called out, there were so many men in the Me Too movement who did just kind of the dodge and weave of deflecting accountability or victim blaming, that kind of thing. Whereas this individual said, you know what, I cannot call myself a feminist because I've been acting in this anti-feminist way. So I am going to work on all of this. And it was just such a refreshing breath of air in how they looked at their behaviors really reflecting their character and how they needed to change that to reflect the kind of character they want to show the world. But that's the difference, is when we get our actions called into question, and if it's of a significant nature of, harassment, bullying, that kind of thing, then we need to look at ourselves as well and be like, is that the kind of character we want to really imbue and, show the world? And what do we need to do to take that accountability and make those repairs? I would say the impact of our words and actions are far more powerful than we give them credit for. And they, again, look at the word crybaby, right? It's just like an innocent word to a lot of people, but for some people, it has a lot of impact and weight to it. And I think too, actually the research shows that the higher levels of suffering that we experience make us want to assign more harmful intent, even if that's not necessarily the case. When we have been really significantly hurt, we are quicker to sort of assign that villain role of they hurt me, they are attacking me. And it's also kind of the same in reverse. When we have impacted someone significantly and we didn't realize that we had hurt them or done something so hurtful, we will then likely be assigned this villain role that might be really, really uncomfortable to sit with. And so that's something for us to navigate. How do we deal with being in this sort of villain role when that isn't maybe who we are and wasn't our intent? And again, just because we didn't mean to do anything wrong doesn't mean we didn't do anything wrong. And I think that's a really big distinction that a lot of people forget. Like, it doesn't matter what we meant, we did something wrong. It's also not the job of the impacted person to be able to mind read the intent. I think what's really, really important here is that when someone isn't impacted, the speaker tends to want to immediately say, well, that's not what I meant. Here was my intent. Here was what I meant. And it can be helpful, but I think that needs to wait. That needs to wait until the impacted has been fully seen and heard and validated, because only then will they be able to really sit with the intent of the speaker. So the focus needs to be more on understanding the impacted first, and then we can look at what did the speaker intend. So let's talk about some also DEI related concepts. So privilege. There is inherent privilege when the conversation stops at intent and does not acknowledge impact. And I mean, I think that is very true. You know, there are so many examples of that just in modern life. But I think it just shows that power dynamic, I think, as we kind of said before. And then as well with unconscious bias. Sometimes our biases play out and get called out with intent versus impact, and we're not really fully aware of them until that happens. And so like having this unconscious bias doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It's just like naturally how we sort of like categorize the world. They're mental shortcuts, but they can be harmful if they're not checked. And so I think, you know, there's been multiple examples of this that have played out in the last couple of years with different terms and different phrases and things like that. And so I don't quite want to use them here, you know, but maybe like the R word, right? Like the R word, people can realize or didn't realize up until maybe the last 10 years that it wasn't a nice word. It was kind of this derogatory, awful word. And they used it previously as this kind of mental shortcut, right? But it was very harmful and got checked, and now it's more known as this very harmful word. If that makes sense. And then microaggressions, which for those who don't know what a microaggression is, it's a slight that demeans, marginalizes, stereotypes, or denigrates. But the best way I kind of like to talk about it is like, it's just like someone just like flicking you a little bit. So it like hurts a little bit, but like you can just kind of like ignore it until a point where you can't. And I think in a way we like we're encouraged to ignore microaggressions when really they need to sort of be seen and acknowledged. So some common microaggressions that I think come up in the SCA are like, you don't look Jewish, or he is Christian, but very open-minded, which again, kind of looking at what sort of the subtext is, right? Or it's great you don't have any accent. Like there's just so much subtext in that, and you can kind of see what the intent is versus the impact of that is, right? So, you know, your hair is so nice. I didn't know it could be like that. I thought it was a wig. And then like, how can I help you? Oh, you're here for the SCA event. And like, again, I think that one really matters with tonality. And I think tonality also can be a microaggression. Or I never would have guessed you were gay. And you have a lot of energy for an old guy. A very kind of ableist message there. And then if you want to research your heritage, you could portray a slave, right? Things like that people have heard within the SCA. And so curious, you know, maybe we'll stop here for a second to see if there's any more questions or any more thoughts on kind of these statements. But I think I see some extra questions in the chat. So curious to stop here.
they're mostly about intent and impact. Do you want to hear those now, or do you want to wait till the end?
Yeah, we can wait till the end unless people have any questions or thoughts on this.
Okay.
We can totally wait. Okay. So let's move forward and then, yeah, let's wait till the end. So let's also look at some more SCA specific examples of where intent versus impact may not be fully understood in terms of what we're talking about. So the common phrase helium hand, right? The intent is maybe to identify someone who volunteers frequently. The impact, though, I've noticed over the last few years is that it's become kind of derogatory and it shames people for volunteering of like, oh, put your helium hand down, and I think, there potentially could be shame there, that others have felt for not volunteering. And so maybe shaming others for volunteering as well. But I think that's something that we need to look at, kind of those statements. Also, the statements around, oh, it's the good old days. Like, it can be very nostalgic and reminiscent, but it depends on like what you're reminiscing on. I think we saw a lot of that, especially in the beginning and middle of 2020 when the pandemic started and we all moved online. Like, there was a ton of focus on, oh, we just need to go back to the good old days and that kind of thing. And I think it harkened back to these like oppressive times, these kind of unsafe times that were really, really hurtful to people. And so understanding like the intent versus the impact of that, I think understanding the intent and impact of belts, I think it demonstrates that this individual is on the path. But then there is an impact that can happen to people with belts where they may experience unwanted or invited criticism based on the belt. And that's something to be mindful of, is that just because someone is wearing a belt doesn't necessarily mean they're totally inviting you in one way or another. And I know, and I think that gets a little messy, because I know when someone takes on a belt, they say like, please let me know if someone has done something wrong. And it is really just kind of, again, the way it's done, that's where it may have that harmful impact. I think we've had some conversations, at least I've seen online lately, about the award culture. I think the intent is to recognize individuals for their contribution to the SCA. I think what I've noticed as well is that some people as an impact can feel entitled or covet certain awards rather than aspiring to them. And then I think, what I've also seen online is kind of conversations around the paradox of tolerance, and how, we should just like accept and tolerate everybody, which becomes a paradox, because if we do that, then we also tolerate the people who have really harmful impacts through harassment, through bullying, through racism, through anti-Semitism, through all of that. Curious if there's other examples that people think of, or anything else coming up in the chat related to this.
636.
I don't see any questions related to that. We're still back at working out the wronged party stuff.
Oh, okay. I'm wondering if we should go back to that, and if there's some things that maybe would be helpful to navigate, or what are your thoughts on?
It's up to you. We are at about 15 more minutes left, so.
Okay. Then let's move forward. There's not too much left. Let's move forward, and then we can come back to what's going on in the chat. So let's talk about this aspect. So this video, and let's see. Let's talk about this video, and hopefully maybe it'll clear up some things that are in the chat.
We are not getting sound on the video.
You're not hearing sound?
I'm not, no.
Okay, that's good to know. Maybe, let's see. I wonder if I stop my share and then I restart it and I see if I can um, share the sound. Yep, that's what we need to do. There we go. Let's try this again. Let me know.
Perfect.
Race, the final frontier. No matter what channel you watch, no matter what feed you aggregate, it seems like everybody everywhere is talking about race right now. And when everybody everywhere is talking about race, that means sooner or later you're gonna have to tell somebody that they said something that sounded racist. So you need to be ready and have a plan in place for how to approach the inevitable that sounded racist conversation. And I'm going to tell you how to do that. The most important thing that you've got to do is remember the difference between the what they did conversation and the what they are conversation. Those are two totally different conversations, and you need to make sure that you pick the right one. The what they did conversation focuses strictly on the person's words and actions and explaining why what they did and what they said was unacceptable. This is also known as the that thing you said was racist conversation, and that's the conversation that you want to have. The what they are conversation, on the other hand, takes things one step further and uses what they did and what they said to draw conclusions about what kind of person they are. This is also known as the I think you are a racist conversation. This is the conversation you don't want to have, because that conversation takes us away from the facts of what they did and the speculation about their motives and intentions, and those are things you can only guess at, you can't ever prove, and that makes it way too easy for them to derail your whole argument. And that is the part that's crucial to understand. When you say, I think he's a racist, that's not a bad move because you might be wrong. That's a bad move because you might be right. Because if that dude really is racist, you want to make sure you hold him accountable and don't let him off easy. And even though intuitively it feels like the hardest way to hit him is just run up on him and say, I think your ass is racist, when you handle it that way, you're actually letting him off easy, because you're setting up a conversation that's way too simple for him to derail and duck out of. Just think about how this plays out every time a politician or a celebrity gets caught out there. It always starts out as a what they did conversation, but as soon as the celebrity and their defenders get on camera, they start doing judo flips and switching it into a what they are conversation. I have known this person for years, and I know for a fact that they are not a racist, and how dare you claim to know what's inside their soul just because they made one little joke about watermelon tap dancing and going back to Africa. And then you try and explain that we don't need to see inside their soul to know that they shouldn't have said all that about the watermelon, and you try to focus on the facts of the situation, but by then it's too late, because the what they are conversation is a rhetorical Bermuda Triangle where everything drowns in a sea of empty posturing until somebody just blames it all on hip-hop and we forget the whole thing ever happened. Don't let this happen to you. When somebody picks my pocket, I'm not going to be chasing him down so I can figure out whether he feels like he's a thief deep down in his heart. I'm going to be chasing him down so I can get my wallet back. I don't care what he is, but I need to hold him accountable for what he did. And that's how we need to approach these conversations about race. Treat them like they took your wallet and focus on the part that matters, holding each person accountable for the impact of their words and actions. I don't care what you are. I care about what you did.
Yeah, helpful little video there that I think help with understanding how to have these conversations with people. It doesn't really matter who you are, what you are, this is what you did. There we go. So when we also have had an issue where we have had this harmful impact on someone, this is what we can do in terms of repair. So I really love this quote by Dr. Maya Angelou: when you know better, do better. So the first thing that we need to do is admit the mistakes or wrongdoings, both internally and externally. And I think if both aren't aligned and if both aren't there, that comes across. And so we may internally be like, okay, I'm sorry, that kind of thing. And it may come across like kind of like disingenuine ingenuine, that word. So we need to kind of do both. Like, we did something wrong. We negatively impacted someone else. We hurt someone else. And we need to acknowledge that both within ourselves and to that other person. We need to apologize earnestly and take accountability for our behavior. I think a lot of the time people can go to, well, I'm sorry, I'm just the worst person ever. That's not apologizing, nor is that taking accountability. We need to say, I'm sorry for X. I am sorry for saying this word crybaby. I am sorry for calling you a crybaby, right? That is that in and of itself. An apology and taking accountability for the behavior. It's not sidestepping it. And then I think internally we need to understand what led to the behavior so that we can change the behavior in the future. Then we also need to increase listening skills, empathy, do our own research, therapy, kind of getting that extra third party in like we talked about earlier. And then we need to show openness and curiosity towards ourselves and others and challenge our internal defensiveness. The speaker's biggest mistake when we recognize that we've had this harmful intent or harmful impact is we sanitize the impact with the intent, which invalidates the impact due to the misaligned. And the listener's biggest mistake, or the person who's been harmed, when their biggest mistake is when they assign the speaker's intent. It's difficult to listen openly when we're ready for that, when we hold on to preconceived notions about their intent. However, again, we need to like really hone in on the impacted first, and then we can look at the speaker's intent once this person has been acknowledged and really the repair has started to happen. So some helpful hints. True listening occurs when you listen to understand rather than listening to respond. So some examples are, oh, wow, I can totally see how you took it that way. Not what I meant at all. I'm sorry, I'll do better. Or I'm so sorry for hurting you. Can you help me understand what was so hurtful so I can do better in the future? Right? That would be like, again, someone called me a crybaby, didn't understand what was so hurtful about it, right? It's not, I'm sorry that you're upset by my words, but that's not what I meant. Which is also known as, I'm sorry your face got in the way of my Frisbee, but I wasn't throwing it at you. It's a subtle difference, but key. Apologize without caveats. So I think I will pause here. I'll stop sharing here and open it up for questions or thoughts. It sounded like we had quite a bit going on there.
Okay. Let's see. Well, I'll start with the most recent and then go backwards. You commented on words that are problematic. Many words have been reclaimed by the community they were previously used to oppress. What would you advise from both a therapeutic and an SCA perspective when it comes to using these words or approaching those members of the community who use these words in play?
So I think that's a really great question, because I think it throws into the question of who are you maybe possibly offended for? Are you offended for yourself? Are you part of that community? Or are you offended on behalf of someone? Because I think that's where we need to kind of challenge that of like, if you are part of that community and you are offended, absolutely speak about that and say, hey, that word is offensive.
It's right here.
And I think if you are not part of that community and you are taking that like offense on behalf of that community, it's something you could speak to and at, you could say, hey, that word can be offensive to this community. And so it could provide an education moment, but I think that's where we have to really look at sort of our intent of why might we want to say something. That makes sense.
Want to make sure everyone's got their mic muted. Okay. How can we handle shame in the SCA? So much of it going around on both sides of the conflict.
Oh man. We need a drink for that conversation. or I've got water right here, so whatever your drink of choice is, right? So shame really boils down to feeling like we are not enough. And I think there's so much in the SCA that sends that message that we're not doing enough or we don't belong. And I think that's partly why the DEIB office and initiative and everything was created was to really help shift the focus into that everyone belongs, everyone is home here. And I think it's going to take some time for that fundamental aspect of the culture to shift. And so I think what has helped me in going into events that then I also notice gets disseminated is going into events, reminding myself I belong here. And even if, I'm not able to do as much as I have done previously, I'm still doing enough. And that then allows me to kind of convey that message to everybody else. Because I notice for myself, the more judgmental I am of myself, the more judgmental I am of others. And so I think the reverse is true. The more compassionate I am of myself, and the more I'm challenging that shame with, I am enough, I belong here, then I'm able to practice that with everybody else. And I think really that part is just going to be a grassroots movement of everybody really embodying that and moving forward with that. That's my soapbox on shame in the SCA in 2 minutes.